So we're excited to have her here today, and the coalition is currently working to establish a new museum in Knoxville. So we're really excited about that. They're doing great things to educate all of us on the people, the moments, and the impact of giving women the right to vote. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always fun to talk about my favorite subject, and that's the Suffrage Coalition and women's suffrage. And it really is a little bit of a misnomer to call it women's suffrage, because while the 19th Amendment, when it passed, did give all women who were citizens in the United States a right to vote, it had an impact on everybody, on men and on immigrants and on everybody in the society. And I guess that's the whole point of suffrage, is to have a voice in the society, and women changed the world once they got the right to vote. So today I'm going to tell you just a little bit about one of the most fascinating stories for me in the suffrage issues. Now, most of you, how many of you already know that Tennessee was the last final necessary state to get us the right to vote? Yay, we've done some good. So. How many of you know it happened because of the letter written by a woman in East Tennessee, Feb Byrne? Good, good. That's why we have the memorial downtown, to make sure that story doesn't get lost. But there are many more stories about what people did in Tennessee and in Knoxville and in this area, East Tennessee particularly, that I'd like to share. And today I'm going to focus on one that happened in Knoxville on November the 27th of 1917. The 19th Amendment was a really simple amendment. All it said is the rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's the operative language of the amendment. Congress shall have the power to enforce the amendment article by appropriate legislation. So very, very simple 19 words that caused a firestorm for 72 years in the United States. It's hard to imagine those words were so controversial. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the daughter of a judge. She wasn't allowed to go to public school, tax-supported schools, because women weren't allowed to do that back in the early 1800s when she was a child. Her father practiced in his home, had a study and office in his home. And she was sitting outside his office one day when he met with a woman who had come to see him because her husband had passed away. Now, during her marriage, she had inherited a farm that was a pretty good farm in terms of providing financial support for herself and her son. But her son was an adult at that point in time, and he was a drunkard. And so he forced her off the farm, made her leave. She went to see Mr. Cady to see how she could get back the farm that she inherited from her parents. Well, the good news, bad news was she did not inherit it from her parents, because married women could not own property in that time. Married women gave up everything they had to get married. And on the death of the husband, it did not come to the woman, it went to the sons. And in that instance, Mr. Cady was not able to help her at all. And she left that room crying, and Elizabeth, sitting outside, 8, 9 years old, was very upset that this nice woman was so upset. So she went to talk to her father about it, and he told her that there wasn't anything he could do for her. That's what the laws were. And so when he left the room, she took his law book and tried to tear the pages out of it to change the law. And so he came back in and caught her and tried to explain to her that that wouldn't really change the laws, even if she tore up all the pages that had that kind of law on it, and that how much he wished that she had been a boy so that she could grow up and change something like that. And I think that changed the course of her life. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton then went on to marry a guy named Henry Thornton, who you may have heard of. He was an internationally known abolitionist. And she became very interested in the abolition movement and became a part of the abolition movement, trying to make sure that we ended slavery in the United States. And that was her primary effort. So for their honeymoon, they took the boat over to England to the World Abolition Conference in London for a honeymoon. And she had been elected she and Lucretia Mott had been elected as representatives or delegates to that World Convention. When they got to the convention, the gentlemen of London refused to admit them because they were women. And the first 3 days of the convention were taken up with a big debate over whether they should be so outrageous as to allow women to sit in on the convention, even though they were delegates. Finally, a compromise was reached, and the compromise was that they could come, but they had to sit in the balcony behind a veil and not speak. Well, they chose to decline that invitation, as you might imagine. And so as they were walking the streets of London, reminiscing and trying to deal with the fact that they were being excluded from something they'd been elected as delegates to, they began to recognize the similarity between the rights of women and the rights of slaves. The inability to own property, the fact that the husband owned the women, they could discipline them, physically discipline them without answering to anyone. They didn't even have rights to their own children. The husbands could literally give the children away without the permission of the mother. That was the kind of legal system they lived in at that time. And so they decided they probably ought to call a convention to address not just the rights of slaves, but also the rights of women. And this Lucretia Mott, who was with her, both of them were Quakers. And as Quakers, they were nonviolent, but they were much more egalitarian than most of the other religions in the United States at that point in time. And so in 1848, they had a tea party. And at that tea party, 5 women sat in Mary Ann McClintock's house, and they decided the way to go about change was to call a women's rights convention and let people come and debate what rights women should have and why. And so they called a convention, put a notice in the Seneca Falls newspaper 2 weeks out from the convention date. And they thought they'd have a few people show up. They didn't really expect a big crowd. You can imagine their surprise when the streets of Seneca Falls, the little upstate New York town, were filled with buggies and people coming to this convention. And there was standing room only to debate the rights of women. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton was tasked with the job of drawing up some resolutions for them to debate and then vote upon. And so she took the Declaration of Independence and she modified it a little bit. And she said that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And like the Declaration of Independence, she listed then the grievances that women had against their treatment in the United States. And it addressed many of the things that I just told you about, and their lack of, they just were not regarded as people. They were regarded essentially as servants, and they were essentially owned by husbands if they married. If they didn't marry, they could keep their own property, and they were taxed on it, and they had no representation. They could not vote. So married or not married, they simply didn't have the rights of a citizen. And so that began the big controversy about women's rights. As a matter of fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that after the convention, the country was seized with laughter from Maine to California, ridiculing them for their suggestions that women should be treated as full citizens, and mostly that women should have the right to vote. That was considered a really outrageous demand. And so they began with the ridicule, the propaganda began on the anti-side. And this is just an example of it. This is a postcard, and many of these postcards were big posters that were posted in public locations. And it says, "Once I get my liberty, no more wedding bells for me." So they immediately turned it into a cultural war. If women get the right to vote, they're going to neglect their husbands, neglect their children, and the family and the home will fall apart when they go to vote once every 4 years for an hour, maybe, that it took. They also, and this is actually a cartoon from England. They had the same kind of dispute going on over there. And you see the gentleman comes home from work and the children are there crying and sad and neglected because mom's gone off to vote and left them alone. I could show you a lot of these. They're really kind of fun, but this one sums it up pretty well. It says, "The origin and development of a suffragette." And by the way, please don't refer to American women as suffragettes. So, suffragette was a term coined by the British that was an insult to the British women seeking the right to vote. The ETTE, French suffix, means smaller, fake, similar to, but not real. So leatherette is not leather, it's vinyl. A dinette, that's not a dining room table, it's a kitchen table. And a suffragette is not a real serious person looking for the right to vote. So in the origin and development, they say at 15, she's a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. And so they portrayed the women who sought to get the right to vote as old and angry and unhappy and unattractive, and they only won it because they couldn't get a man. And that's the image that was used a lot. And they would become, if they got the right to vote, domineering and mean. One of the suffering yets, "Oh, Emily, don't hurt me, don't turn away my love." They predicted that the women would be beating up the men with regularity. And here's another one, what I would do with the suffragists. There you go. The cruelty of the pictures. And so the battle began in 1848 in Seneca Falls at that convention Stanton and Mott called, and it continued for over a century, or near a century. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. She didn't know Susan B. Anthony at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention, but 2 years later they met, and they became great comrades in this effort to see that women got full citizenship. And here they are after 51 years of working together on this mission, not yet successful, but always continuing to be hopeful. And then on October the 20th, 1902, Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away. And there she was. She had worked all of her adult life for women's suffrage and the other rights that went with it, and she never got a chance to vote, ever. And just 4 years later, Susan B. Anthony, who was the bedrock of this movement, passed away in 1906. And the loss of those two women left the movement in somewhat of disarray. They weren't quite sure how to go forward, what strategies to take, and who was going to take over leadership of the movement. And then this young woman, her name is Alice Paul. She's American-born, but she had spent some time in England getting an advanced degree. She was quite smart. Actually, she got like 7 doctoral degrees in her life. She's very smart. But she was over in England studying economics when the suffrage movement in England was going on. And when she came back to the United States and saw that while England got the right to vote, the English women got the right to vote, and the women in America still did not have the right to vote, she decided they needed to take a new tact, and so she did. The year then became, I'm going to just move forward, after a few years working with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, she started her own group called the National Women's Party. And the National Women's Party had basically the same goals as the other older organization, except that they felt that to get the amendment passed, or to get the right to vote, we needed to have a national constitutional amendment to keep it safe. Because there had been times, even back in colonial days, when women would have the right to vote for maybe a year in one colony, and usually only on 1 or 2 elections, nothing to do with the president, typically. And it was taken away because the legislatures, well, you know how legislatures are. They give it, they take it away. That happens all the time. So Alice Paul was determined that this needed to be a national constitutional amendment. And so in the election of 1916, President Wilson was running for a second term at that time. And for the first time in the history of our country, both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, put what they called a suffrage plank into their platform for that election. It wasn't much of a plank, and Alice Paul called it more like a splinter, and here's why. This is quoting from their own platform. The Republican Party, reaffirming its faith in the government of the people, by the people, for the people, as a measure of justice to 1/2 of the adult people in the country, favors the extension of suffrage to women. Sounds good. But recognizes the right of each state to settle a question for itself. So they would not support a constitutional amendment. And the Democrats, their plank was, we recommend the extension of the franchise to the women of the country by the states upon the same terms as to men. Well, recommend's a pretty weak endorsement. So Alice Paul was not very happy with that, but nonetheless, when Wilson won his second term, she and about 300 of her closest friends decided to form what they called a deputation and go to meet with President Wilson to find out how he intended to get the suffrage amendment through Congress, because it had to first go through Congress and then out to the states for ratification. And so he won in a landslide, but when he met with them, it was an icy, chilly reception. He refused to even sit down long enough to talk with them. And his answer to their request for his strategy to get the amendment through Congress was, I am not the leader of my party, but its servant. It is for you to concert public opinion in favor of suffrage. So he just abandoned them, basically, left it to them to convince the world that they should have the right. And so Alice Paul, being Alice Paul, took him at his word, and the next day, out from the National Women's Party headquarters, which is only 2 blocks, about a block from the Supreme Court building, they marched over to the Capitol building, bearing banners with the National Women's Party colors, and they began what was called the Silent Sentinels. They would stand at least 3 on each side of the gates, the 2 different gates to the White House, all day, every day, in the heat, in the snow, in the freezing rain. They stayed out there every single day, 6 days a week, every single week, for literally years as it turned out. And at first, President Wilson was kind of amused by them being out there. Their strategy was to draw attention to the fact that they were there, and so that Wilson would have to see them every time he went home or left home. He'd have to deal with the women, at least see them. And so at first he'd tip his hat to them and invite them in for coffee, and it was fairly friendly until April and in April, when the United States entered World War I, it became less amusing to him. The suffragists continued. President Wilson went on a international tour to try to get people to support democracy and to gather support for democracy and for the war effort. And the women tried to draw attention to his hypocrisy. And so they started putting words on their banners, and they took words from his speeches where he went around the world extolling the beauties of democracy, and they put those words on their banners to demonstrate the irony that over half the people in his own country didn't live in a democracy. They had no voice in their government. Whoops. And so after several more weeks of the women being there, the women, by the way, they stood up against the fence. They were not against the sidewalk. They were not in the streets, and they did not speak or make noises. They spoke only when spoken to in conversation. And this gentleman, Lewis Brownlow, do any of you recognize that name? His grandfather was a congressman from Tennessee. He was an important person in Knoxville, Tennessee, as a matter of fact. And at that point in time, he was the police commissioner for Washington, D.C., where these demonstrations were occurring. And he decided that it was time to shut the women up. And so he ordered the police to arrest them. And they began arresting the suffragists at the gates. And the amazing thing to me is, as soon as they'd arrest one group of them and take them off to the jail to be jailed for, they didn't know what, they didn't typically have any charges against them that they knew how to make even. But as soon as they would arrest them, 6 more would come out from Alice Paul's headquarters and take their place. And women from all over the country, literally every state in the United States, went to Washington, D.C. just to be there to replace them as they got arrested. Women came from other countries. There were 28 other countries in the world that gave women the right to vote before we did. And those women from Poland and from Eastern Europe and from Latin America, Germany, Russia, places kind of surprising to me that they beat us to giving women the right to vote, came and joined the pickets. And the arrests got pretty violent with the women. They were first imprisoned in the district jail in the District of Columbia. Now, it had been closed as uninhabitable for men. It was nasty, it was full of rodents, it was full of vermin. They felt that there was no way they could even put men who were convicted criminals in that jail, but that's where they placed the women. And when so many of them got arrested that the jail couldn't hold them, they then moved them on to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., and they jailed more of them there, sometimes as hundreds of them at a time. The conditions were terrible. The jail was in horrible condition in both locations. This is Lucy Burns. She was Alice Paul's right-hand person. And on a night of terror I'm going to tell you about in a minute, a couple minutes from now, she was left with her hands chained above her head in her cell overnight as torture because she continued to insist that the suffragists should not be considered criminals. Most of them had no charges against them at all. They should be treated as political prisoners instead, which meant they could communicate with the outside world and have visitors and send notes out. And that was not allowed. So when she had to stand like that all night, the women who could see what happened to her in that workhouse in Virginia, they stood and held on to the bars in solidarity with her for the night. Then most of the time they didn't have beds to sleep in. They slept on the floor. These are some of the actual pictures from that jailing. The food they had was notoriously bad and wormy. Wormy oatmeal was a common food. And Alice Paul decided that since they were not being treated correctly, she would go on a hunger strike. And some of the other women followed her in that hunger strike. And that meant they didn't eat at all. And then the jail people began to worry that if some of them died, they might become martyrs for the cause. And so they began force feeding them with crude funnels and hoses. They gave them raw eggs 2 times a day. Most of the time they immediately threw up the raw eggs because raw eggs don't sit so well with us anyway. And the women grew weaker and weaker. Alice Paul spent the rest of her life with certain health problems that came from that force feeding. They got so upset that they couldn't break the will of the women that they sent in a government psychiatrist to see Alice Paul because they believed if he came back and said she was insane, that would help them oppose the women's suffrage movement. So the government psychiatrist went in to see her. And just imagine how disappointed they must have been when the psychiatrist came out and said, she's not crazy, but she has the will of Joan of Arc. And so they didn't get what they wanted, obviously, from that treatment. And this is the women outside continued to protest. To ask for freedom for women is not a crime. Suffrage prisoners should not be treated as criminals, and similar signs as the protests continued and the support grew throughout the country. Now this is Sue Shelton White, and she's there in orange because she's from Tennessee. She's from Jackson, Tennessee. She was a stenographer and became eventually the editor of the National Women's Party's newsletter. Sue Shelton White was jailed 7 times for suffrage. And each time she was jailed, she went right back out to the picket lines and was jailed again. And some of these sentences went on for months. And I will tell you this, I'm a lawyer, so I can tell you this, that of all of those people that were jailed, there's not a single person whose charge held up on appeal. The women won all the appeals. But that takes years, so that wasn't much help, but immediate help. And this is Maud Younger. And Maud Younger was also on the picket line and jailed several times. She was a millionaire from California who had come all the way across the country driving her own vehicle back then, which was really unusual because she was so much in support of suffrage. So Alice Paul asked her, while all this was going on, to please go out and drive her car through the South and do what they called the Dixie tour through the South, so that the Southern gentlemen knew what kind of unchivalrous things were happening to the women in Washington, D.C. And so Maud Younger took up that job. And they were to start in Memphis and then go across the state to Knoxville, then down to Chattanooga, and then on through some of the other southern states as a part of the Dixie tour. And so they got their vehicle and decorated it up, and off they went on the Dixie tour. When they went to Memphis, well, there had been an advance team sent out, and the advance team got hotel rooms for the women to stay in, the speakers, and also got rooms for them to do their speaking in, halls that they reserved. The judges and the lawyers of Memphis got together, and they got the property owners to cancel their contracts. So when the women arrived, they had no place to stay and no place to speak. Then they went to the city council, and they got the city council to pass resolutions against them speaking in public anywhere. And so they were shut down in Memphis. They were shut down in Nashville. They were shut down in all but one city before they got to Knoxville, and that's Jackson, Tennessee. That's Sue Shelton White's home. The mayor of Jackson was an anti-suffragist, but he did believe in the First Amendment. And so he did allow her to speak at that time. But when they got to Knoxville, this same thing happened. The market hall that used to be in the middle of Market Square, that's pictured here, Market Hall canceled its contract with them. Their lodging places canceled their contract, and the lawyers went to the city council to seek a resolution. Well, Lizzie Crozier French was having none of it. Lizzie Crozier French was from Knoxville. She was a suffragist, and she was really serious about the work. Her grandfather had given the land for the old courthouse that we have down on just off Gay Street on Main. And she was not about to have these women shut up. So she went to the courthouse and got one of the judges to agree to let them use his courtroom if she could get the permission of the courthouse committee. The courthouse committee was made up of judges and lawyers. And the judges and lawyers were anti-suffragists for the most part. And so they told her that they would have to give their entire speeches in front of their courthouse committee so they could make sure that they didn't say anything wrong before they'd approve them giving a speech. And so they did that. And the anti-suffragist city attorney cross-examined them for 2 hours on their speech. And then he had to admit that nothing they had to say was seditious, which is what the charge was, and as a result, they should be allowed to speak. So one of the judges then that had given them the courtroom allowed them in, and they decorated the room and were ready for the big event on November the 27th. On that day, let me see, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. This is Mayor McMillan. He was pretty reluctant about allowing them to speak, but the courthouse committee had finally made its decision. The newspaper had covered everything for weeks during this controversy, and he wasn't willing to get in the way. And that's Lizzie Crozier French, who decided that she would not have them be silenced. And so they prepared to do their speech. And on the way to the courthouse on the 27th of November of 1917, Maud Younger reported in her unpublished autobiography that she fully expected to be shot on the way to the Knoxville courthouse. And when she got to the courthouse, the sheriff